A ruthless millionaire bet $1 million that no one could calm the wild-hearted horse, until a quiet farmer did the impossible. Under the frozen sky of Montana, a millionaire turned mercy into a game, offering $1 million to anyone who could calm the wild stallion called Red Ember. Men came with ropes and pride. They all failed. But when a quiet farmer stepped into the snow, silence itself became the loudest answer of all. The wind off the Gallatin Range carried a bite that day, sharp enough to sting the lungs, sharp enough to remind everyone that winter in Montana didn't forgive vanity. The town of Bozeman was wrapped in white, the kind of white that made every color seem like a wound. Beneath a banner strung with blinking lights, Winter Festival, the $1 Million Challenge. A crowd gathered around a fenced ring of trampled snow. At the center stood Conrad Vale, a man who had never known silence. He was tall, silver hair slicked back like an advertisement for success, boots polished to mirror the gray sky. He owned half the ski resorts from here to Jackson Hole, and when he spoke, even the wind seemed to pause. $1 million, he declared through a microphone that cracked from the cold. That's the price for courage or stupidity. 60 seconds with the wild-hearted stallion they call Red Ember. No ropes, no tricks, just you and him. The crowd roared. Phones lifted. Money changed hands. Vendors shouted over the noise, selling hot cider and hope. And then the gate clanged open. Red Ember burst through like a storm given flesh, chestnut coat blazing beneath the pale sun, mane streaked with the color of old fire. His hooves struck the frozen ground with the sound of breaking glass. The animal's breath came out in clouds, each one the shape of defiance. A woman screamed when he reared. Men laughed to hide their fear. Conrad Vale smiled wider, cigar smoke curling in the cold air like arrogance made visible. One by one, the brave, or the foolish, stepped forward. A young rodeo hand lasted 3 seconds before he was thrown into the snow. Another man tried to whisper calm, but the stallion's kick sent him rolling like a broken doll. The crowd cheered louder, hungry for danger, for spectacle, for something to post online before sunset. At the far edge of the crowd, near a pickup stacked with jars of Montana honey and burlap sacks of winter potatoes, Eli Turner stood quietly. His coat was plain brown, his beard frosted with breath. He didn't shout or bet. He didn't even seem to belong in the noise. His hands, rough and cracked from soil and beeswax, rested loosely at his sides. When Red Ember's head snapped toward the stands, something in Eli moved. A small, involuntary breath, slow and steady, the kind you take when you're afraid to startle a wounded thing. And somehow, the stallion stilled. Only for a heartbeat, but it was there. The trembling stopped. The eyes softened. Jonah Reed, a Tardian, local boy clutching a battered camera, caught it, the frame where a wild creature met a man's stillness and didn't run. Nobody else noticed. The crowd had already turned to the next volunteer. But Jonah kept his lens on that farmer with the honey jars, wondering why the air around him seemed to hum differently, like a note only animals could hear. When the event ended in chaos, 3 riders bruised, 1 broken wrist, and Conrad Vale collecting applause like interest on a loan, Eli packed up his unsold jars and loaded them into the truck. He didn't speak when Jonah approached, panting from excitement. "Sir, I think he saw you," the boy said. "The horse, he stopped when you breathed." Eli gave a half smile that looked more like a wince. "Horses don't see me, son. They see what's quiet around them." The boy blinked, not sure what that meant. Eli tightened the strap on his tailgate and climbed into his old Chevy. As the engine groaned to life, a gust of snow carried the faint echo of Conrad's voice through the loudspeakers. $1 million for the one who can tame the storm. Eli looked in his rearview mirror. Red Ember was still inside the pen, sides heaving, nostrils flaring steam into the pale dusk. Their eyes met once more. Gray and amber, distance and longing. And then Eli turned onto the road that led away from town. The sun slid behind the mountains, painting the snow blue. The radio crackled, playing an old country song about loss and staying. Eli turned it down to silence. The hum of the tires, the faint sweetness of spilled honey, and the memory of the horse's breathing filled the cab. He didn't know why he kept seeing those eyes in the dark windshield reflection. Back in town, Conrad Vale lit another cigar and signed a sponsorship check to a local insurance company, already planning tomorrow's headlines. To him, the day had been perfect. Noise, money, and fear all dancing to his rhythm. He didn't notice the boy with the camera reviewing the quiet frame again and again, whispering. He wasn't trying to win. He was just standing there. That night, as the temperature dropped and the valley froze into glass, Eli parked beside his weathered farmhouse. The bees slept in their boxes beneath tarps. The river whispered beneath the ice, and the world felt too loud even in silence. He stood there for a long time, breath misting under the porch light before murmuring to the empty air, "Maybe some storms don't need taming, just someone who'll stay until they pass." The words hung there, half prayer, half promise, and followed him inside. The snow along the Gallatin River turned glassy under the pale morning sun, and the world outside Eli Turner's cabin looked like it had been carved from ice. His small farmhouse crouched at the edge of the woods, a line of smoke curling from the chimney, bees sleeping in wooden hives wrapped in burlap and wax paper. Inside, the faint scent of raw, honey and pine wood filled the air. Eli moved slowly, the way men do when they've learned that silence is a kind of prayer. He checked the hives, brushing frost from the lids, his breath visible in steady, patient clouds. The hum of the bees, muted by winter, was something he could feel more than hear, like a low heartbeat beneath the earth. He liked that rhythm. It reminded him of steadiness, of staying, of the kind of life that doesn't need applause. The radio inside the kitchen murmured with static before catching a local news update. The Bozeman Winter Festival continues today. Billionaire Conrad Vale's $1 million horse challenge will resume this weekend. Red Ember remains unbroken. The voice was cheerful, almost proud. Eli turned the dial down until it clicked into silence. He sat at the table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. Across from him, an empty chair. He hadn't sat opposite anyone since the winter the ice gave way. 6 years ago, maybe 7 now. The river had taken his brother during the thaw, and the sound of cracking ice still lived in the back of his skull. People said grief fades with time, but Eli knew better. It doesn't fade. It just finds quieter places to live. A knock broke the stillness. Jonah Reed stood on the porch, his camera slung around his neck, cheeks red from the cold. "Sir," he said, breathless, "I brought you something." He handed over a small flash drive wrapped in a napkin. "It's from the festival. You should see it." Eli raised a brow. "Why?" "Because the horse, he saw you. When you breathed, he stopped. Just for a second." Eli almost smiled, the corner of his mouth creasing into something close to disbelief. Maybe he just got tired. "No, sir," Jonah insisted. He listened. Inside, the old laptop on the counter whirred to life. Jonah clicked open the video. There it was. The chaos, the laughter, the shimmer of cold light on metal rails, and then, in the middle of the noise, Eli's still figure. The camera zoomed slightly. Red Ember's head turned, ears forward, body frozen mid-lunge. A cloud of breath hung between them like a truce. Eli watched in silence. He didn't move when the clip ended. He only rubbed a thumb along the edge of the table, tracing a groove worn by years of coffee cups. "That's not something to chase, boy," he said quietly. "Some things happen once because they're not meant to be owned." Jonah hesitated. "But they're doing it again tomorrow. You could—" "No." Eli stood, walked to the window. Outside, snow fell in slow spirals, catching sunlight like dust in a cathedral. "Let the rich man have his noise. I've got work that doesn't need an audience." The boy nodded reluctantly and left, his boots squeaking down the steps. When the sound faded, Eli remained by the window, watching the light move across the hives. A bee drifted inside, late to sleep, bumping clumsily against the glass before finding its way out again. He thought about that brief stillness in the corral, the way the horse had stopped, how their breaths had matched for an instant. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Later that evening, Eli lit a small candle near the hives, the way his brother used to do on bitter nights. The flame flickered, reflected in the frost, tiny and defiant. He pulled the red scarf from a nail by the door, old, frayed, smelling faintly of smoke, and wrapped it around his wrist. A habit, or maybe a memory. As night deepened, he poured a spoonful of honey into his tea and sat by the window, listening to the faint creaks of ice shifting on the river. The sound no longer felt like fear. It felt like a heartbeat returning from far away. He opened Jonah's video one more time. This time, he muted the sound. Without the crowd, without Conrad Vale's taunts, all that remained was breath and stillness. In that quiet frame, he saw not a contest, but a conversation. Two survivors, neither speaking, both waiting to see if the other would leave first. The next morning, Eli found himself loading honey jars into the back of his truck again. He told himself he was heading to town to sell them. But as the engine started, he looked toward the west, the road that led to Bozeman, and the snow there glittered in the light like something calling his name. He turned the wheel west. The road back to Bozeman cut through fields glazed with frost, the morning light caught between silver and blue. Eli Turner drove slow, his old pickup humming a tired tune beneath the weight of honey jars that clinked gently together. He told himself he was heading for the market. He needed gas money, new seed potatoes, maybe a tin of wax for the hive lids. But the truth settled somewhere lower in his chest, where logic couldn't quite reach. By the time he arrived, the winter festival was quieter. The carnival music from the day before had faded, and the scent of roasted chestnuts mixed with diesel and cold air. The corral sat at the far end of the square, ringed by fresh snow. There was no crowd today, only a few workers sweeping sawdust, and at the far end of the fence stood Mara Whitebird, her dark braid heavy with frost. She carried a clipboard and spoke low to one of the handlers, her tone calm but edged with authority. Eli stopped near the rail, hands buried in his coat pockets. Red Ember was inside the pen, pacing, tail cutting sharp lines in the air. The stallion's hooves pressed deep into the snow, breath coming in fast bursts that hung like smoke. Mara turned toward him, studying the stranger at the fence. "You're not with the press," she said. "No," Eli replied. "Just a farmer." "Then you're the first quiet one today." Her smile was small, but real. She nodded toward the horse. "He doesn't like cameras or shouting. They keep trying anyway. You'd think a man with all that money would listen to the experts." Eli's eyes followed Red Ember's pacing. "Experts don't make good headlines," he said. Mara studied him a moment longer, as if weighing whether his stillness was practiced or natural. "You saw him yesterday, didn't you?" "I did." "And he saw you?" Eli didn't answer. He only unwrapped the frayed red scarf from his wrist, rubbing the fabric between his fingers. Mara stepped closer to the fence. "You want to try something?" He hesitated. "Try?" "Nothing dramatic. Just breathing. Most men come in with rope and pride. Try stillness instead." It was an odd invitation, but Eli nodded. He stepped closer to the fence, his boots crunching softly in the snow. He exhaled once, twice, the way he did when checking on the hives. Slow, even, without forcing calm. Red Ember's ears flicked backward, then forward again. The horse's movement slowed, muscles rippling beneath his chestnut coat. The light had shifted into what locals called the blue hour, that moment before dusk when snow turned to silver and air to glass. Everything held still. The handlers froze mid-step. Mara's pencil stopped above the paper, and only Eli's steady breath seemed to move. For a brief, fragile instant, Red Ember stopped pacing. His head turned, eyes dark and searching. Eli didn't meet the gaze directly. He let his shoulders sink, his jaw unclench. The red scarf hung loose from his wrist, trembling slightly in the cold breeze. The horse took one cautious step toward him, then another. The world around them dimmed until all that remained was breath and the whisper of hooves over snow. Then the stallion snorted, a sharp, startled sound, and turned away, trotting back to the far side of the corral. The moment broke. The noise of the town crept back in, laughter from a vendor, the creak of a food truck door, a radio ad murmuring about home insurance rates and mortgage refinancing. Mara let out the breath she'd been holding. "You didn't scare him. That's rare." Eli nodded, his eyes still on the horse. "He's not scared of people," he said quietly. "He's scared of what they want." She smiled at that, half in respect, half in sorrow. "You might be the first one who understands that." The handlers began to pack up. Mara scribbled something on her clipboard, then tore off a small piece of paper and handed it to Eli. "Come back tomorrow. Same time. The light does something to him during the blue hour. Maybe it'll do something to you too." Eli looked down at the note. It was just an address and a time. No signature. "You sure Vale will let that happen?" "I'm the veterinarian, not his employee," she said simply. "Besides, I'll tell the sheriff it's behavioral research. They'll give us 20 minutes before Vale even hears about it." He almost smiled. "You sound like someone who's had to outsmart money before." Her expression softened. "Every day." That night, Eli stopped by the diner on Main Street. He ordered soup and coffee, ate slow, watching the reflection of Christmas lights in the window. The waitress recognized him from the honey jars he sold each summer. "You back at the market again?" she asked. He nodded. "Something like that." When he left, the town had settled into silence, the kind that made footsteps echo longer than they should. He climbed into the truck and rested his forehead on the steering wheel. The faint smell of wax and smoke filled the cab. He thought of Mara's calm eyes, of Red Ember's half-step forward, of that blue light that turned everything fragile. For the first time in years, Eli didn't drive straight home. He parked by the river, where the ice groaned faintly under the weight of winter. The same sound that once haunted him now felt like breathing, a deep, steady inhale from the earth itself. He sat there until the cold numbed his fingers, and when he finally started the engine, the words escaped his lips without plan or purpose. Tomorrow, then. The headlights carved through the snow as he turned back toward town, the scarf still hanging loosely around his wrist. The next afternoon came dressed in gray light and drifting snow. Bozeman's streets were quieter, as if the town itself was tired of clapping for things it didn't understand. Eli parked his pickup behind the veterinary truck near the fairground, the same scarf tied at his wrist like a promise he couldn't name. The wind had teeth. It bit through the layers of his coat and whistled against the empty bleachers. Mara Whitebird was already there, bundled in a wool parka, her braid hidden under a fur-lined hood. She nodded in greeting, a thermos in her hand. "You came back," she said. "Guess I owed someone a conversation," Eli replied. She smiled softly. "He's been restless all morning. Maybe he's been waiting." Inside the corral, Red Ember moved in restless circles. His hooves struck the frozen ground with dull thuds, and each exhale clouded the air in white. The handlers had gone, replaced by 2 deputies who stood with steaming coffee and indifference. One of them asked if this was another therapy experiment. Mara only nodded and said, "Behavioral regulation study." The man shrugged and turned away. Eli slipped a gloved hand into his pocket and drew out an apple, small, red-skinned, dusted with frost. It had come from the last crate in his root cellar. He rubbed it on his sleeve until the skin shone and placed it gently on the snow just inside the fence. Mara watched him. "You don't plan to hand it to him?" Eli shook his head. "You don't offer peace by forcing it." The sky deepened into that strange shade between silver and twilight, the blue hour again, but colder now, sharper at the edges. Red Ember's pacing slowed. He saw the apple, nostrils flaring. Steam rose from his back, turning him into something half spirit, half storm. Eli stayed where he was, only his breath, moving. He remembered the beehives back home, the way his brother used to hum low to calm the bees before lifting a frame. He found that same hum somewhere deep in his chest. A note that wasn't quite a sound, more like steady breathing. The stallion lowered his head, pawed the snow, and took one step toward the apple. Then another. The deputies straightened, their hands tightening on the rail. Mara raised a hand for silence. The air thickened with stillness. Red Ember's muzzle reached the apple, brushed it once, twice, then sent it rolling with a quick toss of his head. The fruit bounced and split, a thin spray of juice glistening on the snow. He snorted, not angry, curious. Eli almost smiled. "He's telling me it's not about the prize," he said quietly. Mara nodded. "Horses don't eat what they don't trust." For a while, nothing moved but breath. Then a truck engine roared somewhere behind the bleachers, the kind of careless noise only money makes. Conrad Vale's silver SUV slid to a stop, throwing up powder. He stepped out in a camel coat, gloves of black leather, his smile sharp as glass. "Well, well," he called. "Our quiet farmer returns. Couldn't stay away from the spotlight, could you?" Eli didn't turn. Didn't know silence came with one. Conrad's laugh rang false. "That horse isn't a sermon, Turner. He's an investment. You think breathing near him makes you some kind of saint?" Mara stepped forward, her voice cool. "We agreed to a controlled session, Mr. Vale. No interference." "Controlled?" he scoffed. "You call standing still in the cold control?" He gestured toward the horse. "You're wasting time. That thing's pure fury. The only language it understands is dominance." Eli finally turned his head. "Then maybe we've been talking too loud." For a moment, their eyes locked. One man born of profit, the other of patience. Conrad smirked, lit a cigar, and walked back to his truck. "I'll give you your little experiment," he said. "But when it fails, I'll make sure it fails loudly." When he was gone, the silence felt heavier, more fragile. Mara exhaled slowly. You just made yourself a target for his pride. Eli picked up the bruised half of the apple and tossed it lightly over the fence. It landed near Red Ember's front hoof. The horse looked down, then up again, as if measuring the farmer's intent. Finally, he snorted and backed away, tail swishing. "That's enough for today," Mara said softly. Eli nodded, but his gaze stayed on the horse. "He's not afraid of people," he murmured. "He's afraid of what happens when they stop meaning what they say." As the sun slipped behind the mountains, Mara scribbled notes on her clipboard. The deputies left first, engines fading into the snow. She turned to Eli, voice low. "Tomorrow will be harder. He tests consistency." Eli tightened the scarf around his wrist. "So do bees," he said. "They sting when you flinch." She smiled faintly. "Then don't flinch." By the time Eli reached his truck, night had settled. His breath plumed against the windshield as he started the engine. The cracked half of the apple sat on the passenger seat, glistening faintly in the dashboard light. He didn't throw it away. Some gestures, he thought, needed time to ripen. As he drove back toward the river road, the radio played low, an ad for life insurance fading into a country ballad about second chances. He listened without hearing the words, eyes on the pale ribbon of snow ahead. In the rearview mirror, the fairground lights receded, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement. A dark shape, standing still at the fence, watching his tail lights disappear into the night. Back at his cabin, the hives were silent under their tarps, the moon rising pale as bone. Eli stood by the porch, the broken apple in his palm. The skin had turned darker where it split, juice sticky against his glove. He set it on the railing, a small offering to the cold, and whispered, "Tomorrow, we'll try again." Inside, the warmth felt strange after the hush of the corral. He poured a mug of tea, thickened it with honey, and stared at the steam curling upward. It reminded him of the horse's breath, the way it hung in the air before fading. He wondered if trust worked the same way. Fragile, visible only in the right light. He didn't know that Mara was still awake in her truck, parked by the fence, watching Red Ember circle once more, then stop beside the apple core and lower his head. She didn't film it. Some moments were too delicate for proof. The moon rose higher, turning the snow to silver. Somewhere far off, a church bell rang once and fell silent, as if thinking better of it. The blue hour had passed, but the stillness it left behind stayed, stitched quietly into the night. The morning arrived brittle and white, sunlight catching on the river like a blade. Every fence post along the highway glittered with hoarfrost, and the cold felt older than memory. Eli Turner's truck rumbled through it, the heater barely working, the thermos beside him steaming faintly. He hadn't slept much. All night, he'd dreamed of hooves striking ice, of breath hanging in blue air, of a sound so sharp it could split the world open. By the time he reached the fairground, the sky was pale gold, and a thin fog hugged the edges of the corral. Mara Whitebird was already there, brushing snow off the rails. She greeted him with a small nod, her cheeks red, her eyes alert. "You feel it?" she asked quietly. Eli frowned. "Feel what?" "The pressure. Before things break, there's always a sound." He didn't answer, but he knew what she meant. The air felt thick, expectant. He'd known that kind of stillness once, on the river, the day before the ice gave way. The same silence that had stolen his brother. They didn't speak again. Together they watched as red ember moved through the fog, each step sending small bursts of frost swirling. The horse's breath came out in slow, heavy clouds, and his coat shimmered dark and wet beneath the thin sun. He wasn't angry today, but alert, his ears flicking back and forth, waiting for something unseen. The handlers arrived late, followed by two men in dark coats, Conrad Vale's employees. One carried a clipboard, the other a speaker system. "Mr. Vale wants the sound checks to start early," one said briskly. "Festival crowds doubled. He wants atmosphere." Mara stepped forward. "No loud noises. The stallion reacts badly to metallic tones." The man shrugged. "Orders are orders." He tapped the mic. It squealed, a piercing metallic cry that sliced through the air. Red ember exploded. The stallion reared high, front hooves flashing. His scream tore through the fog, raw and jagged. Mara shouted for them to cut the sound. Eli moved instinctively, stepping toward the fence but not climbing it. His pulse hammered. The noise hit something deep inside him, an echo of the night the river split apart. "Kill the mic!" Mara barked. One of the deputies lunged and yanked the plug. The feedback cut off, leaving a silence so sudden it rang in the ears. Red ember still circled wildly, nostrils flaring, eyes rolling white. Eli stood still. He could taste metal on his tongue. The cold had that flavor sometimes, the iron tang of fear. His breath caught, and for a moment he wasn't in Bozeman anymore. He was back on the riverbank, watching his brother slip beneath the ice, the world shattering with a sound like this. Mara's voice cut through the haze. "Eli, breathe." He did. Slowly. In through his nose, out through his mouth. His hands shook, but he kept breathing. Red Ember's frenzy began to slow. The stallion's movements softened into pacing, his head tossing lower, ears twitching toward the fence. Eli lifted his voice, low but clear. "I couldn't stop it then," he said, the words not for anyone else. "I can't stop what's already broken, but I can stay." The horse's head swung toward him. Their eyes met through the frost and rails. The animal's chest heaved, steam pouring from his nostrils. Eli took another step closer, boots crunching in the snow. "It's all right," he whispered. "You don't have to run from the noise. It's just sound. It passes." Red Ember's sides shuddered. Then slowly he exhaled, a long, rough sigh that rolled through the corral like the first thaw of spring. The deputies stared, wide-eyed. Mara pressed a hand to her clipboard to keep it from trembling. "He's co-regulating," she said softly, almost to herself. Eli's knees felt weak. He rested his hand on the top rail, his breath steadying with the horses. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was full. Of effort, of shared exhaustion, of something unnamed but deeply human. From behind them came the sound of tires on ice. Conrad Vale's SUV again, idling close. He stepped out, clapping slowly, sarcasm thick as his cologne. "Well," he said, "this is touching. The farmer and his therapy session. Maybe we should sell tickets." Mara's face hardened. "You nearly got someone killed with that sound check." Conrad laughed. "Please, the horse needs to toughen up. So does your friend." He looked at Eli. "Tell me, Turner, how's this feel? Playing preacher to a beast that can't hear you?" Eli didn't rise to it. He simply leaned on the rail, watching the stallion's breath fade into the morning air. "Feels quieter than whatever you're selling," he said. For the first time, something flickered behind Conrad's eyes. Irritation, maybe, or confusion. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Tomorrow, we make it official. Noon. The cameras, the crowd, the $1 million minute. If you've got the nerve, step in. Show them what patience buys. If not, stay home and sell honey." Eli met his gaze evenly. "You don't buy trust. You earn it." Conrad smirked. "That's the difference between us. I don't earn, I own." He left in a spray of slush. The silence returned, broken only by Red Ember's steady breathing. Mara approached Eli slowly. "He'll use the crowd to rattle both of you," she said. "You don't have to do this." Eli stared at the horse. "Maybe not, but I can't let him turn silence into a sideshow." They stood together for a while, watching the fog lift. A light snow began to fall, soft flakes catching in Mara's hair. Red Ember dropped his head, pawed once at the ground, and exhaled again. The sound reminded Eli of the river loosening after a long freeze. When he finally drove home, the world had gone quiet again. He parked by the hives, the sun already low behind the trees. The hum inside the boxes was faint, like a heartbeat under snow. He touched the scarf at his wrist, still stiff with frost, and whispered, "Tomorrow." The next dawn would carry the weight of a wager, and the sound of ice might come again. But this time, he would not run. By noon the next day, Bozeman had become a city of sound. Cars crowded the roads, their tires chewing the slush. Loudspeakers tested microphones that spat and echoed across the square. Vendors fried dough in oil that hissed like applause. The banners read, $1,000 Presents Challenge, Courage or Chaos. The air buzzed with caffeine, camera drones, and the hum of 1,000 expectations. Eli Turner parked his truck 2 blocks away, far enough that the noise came softer, like something happening in another world. He sat for a long moment before opening the door. The scarf around his wrist was stained darker from frost and honey wax, its threads catching the light. He wasn't sure why he'd come, maybe because running had stopped working years ago. When he reached the corral, the bleachers were already full. Reporters adjusted their lenses, betting men whispered odds, and somewhere in the chaos, Conrad Vale stood at the center platform, microphone in hand, smiling as if the day itself belonged to him. He looked polished, untouchable, the kind of man who sold luxury properties and high-end insurance policies with the same smile he now turned on the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Conrad began, his voice booming through the speakers. "Today, we'll see what patience is worth. 1 minute inside that ring with the wild-hearted Red Ember. No rope, no whip, no weapon. Just presence." The crowd cheered, their voices a low thunder. Red Ember paced behind the gate, muscles taut, eyes wide, the gleam of sunlight sliding across his chestnut coat. Mara Whitebird stood near the vet's station, clipboard clutched tight. She caught Eli's eye across the ring and gave a single nod. Sheriff Deke, who had been watching the setup with visible unease, leaned toward Conrad. "You agreed, Vale. No amplification once he steps in. Animal welfare regulation." Conrad's grin never faltered. "Of course, Sheriff. We'll make it fair. Quiet as prayer." The irony slid through the air like a knife. Eli stepped up to the rail. The noise faded as he crossed into the open space, as if the sound itself bowed out of the moment. His boots sank half an inch into the churned snow. He removed his gloves and slipped them into his coat pocket. His hands were raw, cracked from years of work, smelling faintly of smoke and beeswax. Conrad's voice followed him. "Remember, farmer, you asked for this. 60 seconds. Not a breath less." Eli didn't answer. He simply lifted his head, drawing in a long inhale, and exhaled into the cold until the air around him misted white. The world narrowed to breath and heartbeat. The gate clanged open. Red Ember surged into the ring, hooves thundering, mane slashing the air like a whip. The crowd gasped. Eli didn't move. He let the storm come. At 10 seconds, the stallion circled him, snorting, snow flying up in bursts around his legs. The animal's chest heaved, breath rolling out in clouds that mingled with Eli's. At 20 seconds, Eli turned his head slightly, just enough to show his face but not enough to challenge. His breathing was measured. 4 counts in, 6 out. The scarf trembled on his wrist. At 30 seconds, Red Ember lunged closer. The ground shook. The horse stopped a stride short, muscles quivering. They stood locked in that space, air thick enough to hold sound captive. Somewhere behind the fence, Mara whispered, "Don't break the rhythm." Eli inhaled again, deep, calm. He thought of the bees at dawn, the steady hum that kept fear at bay. He thought of his brother's voice saying, "Stay still, Eli. The ice only breaks when you run." 40 seconds. The stallion dropped his head slightly, snorting hard. His breath struck Eli's chest like heat. Eli lifted one hand, palm open, fingers loose. No command. No request. Just a quiet offering. 45 seconds. The world contracted. The sound of the crowd dimmed until only the pulse of breath remained. Red Ember's ears twitched forward. His nostrils flared once, twice. 55 seconds. He stepped closer. 60 seconds. The horse's muzzle touched Eli's palm, soft, warm, trembling with life. The stopwatch clicked. Silence. Real silence, so complete that even the wind forgot to move. For a moment, no one seemed to breathe. Then the crowd erupted, shattering the stillness with cheers that rolled like surf. Cameras flashed. People shouted. Eli stayed where he was, his hand still open against the horse's muzzle. His lips moved, a whisper carried away by the noise. "Thank you." Red Ember exhaled, a deep sound that vibrated through the air. He didn't bolt. He didn't rear. He simply stood, calm as stone, while the farmer lowered his hand and stepped back. Conrad Vale clapped, but there was no warmth in it. He picked up the microphone again, his smile tightening. 60 seconds of standing still? That's what passes for courage now? His voice cut through the cheering like sleet. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not pretend this was a miracle. The horse is exhausted. He's been coddled. The crowd wavered, half confused, half offended. Mara moved to the rail, her tone sharp but steady. You set the rules, Mr. Vale. 60 seconds. No rope, no whip, no violence. He met them all. You owe him the prize. Conrad's smirk deepened. $1 million for breathing? You must be joking. Sheriff Deke stepped forward. Rules are rules. But the crowd had turned restless, murmurs spreading like wind through dry grass. Eli looked around, at the faces shining with awe and doubt, at the horse still standing quiet beside him. He shook his head slowly. Keep your money, he said, his voice barely above the wind. The murmur grew louder. You're walking away? Someone shouted. After winning? Eli's gaze never left Red Ember. You don't win peace. You share it. Then he turned toward the gate, boots crunching on the snow, leaving behind only his breath hanging in the cold air. The applause that followed wasn't the wild cheer of gamblers. It was slower, softer, uncertain, like people clapping not for victory, but for recognition. Conrad shouted something after him, words drowned in noise, but Eli didn't turn around. Mara caught up with him near the trucks. You know he'll come after you, she warned. Eli nodded. He already did. I just didn't bite. She smiled faintly, but her eyes glimmered. What are you going to do now? See if quiet can still grow in a world that's this loud. He loaded his gloves into his pocket, the scarf around his wrist fluttering in the wind like a flag that had already surrendered. And somehow, that surrender looked like victory. As the cameras packed up, a news voiceover rolled through the speakers advertising financial planning, services and home equity loans, trying to reclaim the noise. But most of the crowd wasn't listening. They were still watching the farmer walk away, and the horse that didn't follow. Because he didn't have to. When Eli reached the end of the lot, Mara was still standing by the corral, her hands clasped together, the wind whipping her braid across her face. Red Ember lifted his head toward the mountains, exhaled once, and the mist of his breath caught the sunlight, gold against the cold. The next morning, Bozeman woke to the sound of disbelief. Newspapers at every cafe counter carried the same photo. Eli Turner, standing in a blizzard of snow, his open hand resting gently against Red Ember's muzzle. The headline screamed, "The farmer who refused $1 million." In a world built on noise, the quiet had found a way to speak louder. Conrad Vale didn't take it well. At sunrise, his voice filled the radio stations, declaring fraud. That horse was sedated, he told one interviewer. A trick staged for sympathy. His lawyers sent letters. His PR team spun stories. By mid-morning, a banner ad online claimed, "Miracles don't pay mortgages. Invest in stability with Vale Properties." The irony was as sharp as the winter air. Meanwhile, Eli sat in the diner on Main Street, the same seat he always took, drinking black coffee that tasted faintly of burnt sugar. Mara Whitebird slipped into the booth across from him, shaking the snow from her coat. "You've started a storm," she said. "I didn't mean to." "No one ever does." She slid a small envelope across the table. "Vale wired the money to an escrow account. Sheriff Deke says you can still claim it. He's calling it a matter of principle." Eli pushed it back. "Principles don't come with price tags." She studied him. "You realize he's not going to let this go?" He nodded slowly. "Noise never does. It needs to be louder than whatever truth it's hiding." Outside, the street was busy again. Reporters with cameras, kids holding cardboard signs that said, "Let the farmer speak." The wind carried the faint smell of fried dough and diesel fuel. It smelled of spectacle again, the kind that always left Eli feeling hollow. When he stepped outside, microphones were already waiting. "Mr. Turner, is it true you rejected the prize? Was the horse trained beforehand? Are you starting a movement?" Eli didn't answer. He just walked past them, his boots crunching in the snow, the scarf at his wrist fluttering red against the white. He didn't need to defend silence. He just needed to live in it. At the corral, Red Ember stood calm, head bowed over a trough of clear water. Mara had stayed by him through the night, worried that the stress might return. But when Eli approached, the stallion lifted his head, ears forward, eyes soft. The crowd noise faded behind him. He stopped a few feet from the fence, exhaled once, and whispered, "Still here?" The horse snorted, warm mist rising between them. From the far end of the arena came the sound of an engine. Conrad's SUV rolled to a stop, tires crunching hard against the packed snow. He stepped out in a black overcoat, face pale with anger. "You think this is over?" he called. "You embarrassed me in front of the state. You think you can walk away like some folk hero?" Eli turned to face him. "You offered a bet. I met it. You turned it into a circus." Conrad's laugh was brittle. "You could have had everything. Land, comfort, respect. Those aren't things you buy," Eli said evenly. Mara stepped forward, her breath showing white. "Mr. Vale, enough. The crowd's moved on. You should too." But Vale wasn't listening. He reached into the back of his SUV and pulled out the same black briefcase from the day before. He snapped it open. The wind caught the corners of the $100 bills and sent a few skittering across the snow like leaves. "This is real," he hissed. "All you have to do is take it, stand on that platform, smile for the cameras, and I'll hand you the $1 million. Eli didn't even look at the money. "You still don't understand. That horse didn't bow because of me. He chose calm because I stopped asking him to surrender." The briefcase snapped shut. Conrad's voice dropped low. "You'll regret making me look small." He climbed back into the SUV, door slamming like a gunshot, and roared away, leaving exhaust curling through the cold. When he was gone, the only sound left was wind. Mara turned to Eli. "He'll try again, you know. Men like him always do." Eli's shoulders eased a little. "Then we'll just keep being quieter." That evening, the fairground emptied out, leaving footprints and a few forgotten coffee cups half buried in snow. Jonah Reed arrived just as Eli was tightening the latch on the gate. He carried his camera, but didn't film. "Sir," he said shyly, "people online are calling it a miracle. Some want you to start a channel. Lessons from the quiet farmer. They think you can teach peace." Eli smiled faintly. "Peace isn't something you teach, son. It's something you practice when no one's looking." Jonah looked at the horse, then back at Eli. "Still, maybe folks need to see what that looks like." "Maybe," Eli admitted. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. As twilight spread, the boy left, and Eli stayed by the fence, watching Red Ember move along the far edge of the pen. The light caught the stallion's coat, setting it aglow like copper under ice. He pawed once, snorted softly, and came forward until the fence shadow fell across both of them. Eli lifted his hand, palm open. The horse leaned close, breath washing over his fingers. For a second, everything was still. The world, the wind, the noise of life. From somewhere in town, a bell rang once. The sound was muffled, wrapped in snow. It didn't trigger fear this time, only a strange calm. Mara's voice echoed softly behind him. You see? Even the bells can learn to whisper. Eli smiled. Then maybe there's hope for the rest of us. He lingered until the stars began to show, sharp points against the indigo sky. The temperature dropped, but he didn't feel the cold. His thoughts drifted to the hives waiting at home, the hum beneath the snow, the slow thaw that always followed the hardest winter. When he finally turned to leave, Red Ember followed along the fence line, step for step, until the road curved out of sight. Later that night, Eli sat by the river. The ice cracked softly under the weight of the current, but it no longer sounded like fear. It sounded like forgiveness. He took off the red scarf and laid it on the snow beside him, the color glowing faintly in the moonlight. Tomorrow, he knew, the noise would start again. Headlines, offers, interviews. But for now, there was only stillness, and a single truth that even money couldn't buy. Silence, when shared, was not emptiness. It was understanding. He breathed in the cold air, steady and slow, and whispered, We stayed. Somewhere in the distance, the horse answered with a low, peaceful exhale, carried across the frozen fields. The first hint of spring came to Montana the way forgiveness does, slow, uncertain, and too quiet for anyone to notice at first. The snow that had buried the valley began to melt from underneath, trickling into the river until it hummed like a low, steady chord. The air smelled different now, of damp earth and pine sap, and the days were longer, as if the world was finally willing to look itself in the eye again. Eli Turner stood by the fence line of a new pasture, hammer in hand. The field stretched open toward the foothills, dotted with thawing patches of grass. Behind him, a simple wooden sign leaned against a rock. The paint was still wet. Quiet Sky Sanctuary. He didn't plan to name it that, not really. Mara had painted the words herself after he'd cleared the land, saying softly, Every creature deserves a sky that listens back. Red Ember grazed nearby, his coat a deeper shade of copper now that winter had released its grip. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if the earth no longer needed to be feared. When he lifted his head, his mane caught the sunlight, and for a moment Eli thought he saw steam rising from embers again. The wild, still living, but softened at the edges. Mara arrived mid-morning, her truck bed loaded with feed, hay, and 2 saplings wrapped in burlap. She jumped down, her boots sinking into the thawed mud. You're planting trees? Eli asked. Shade for him, she said, nodding toward the horse. And maybe for you? He smiled faintly. I suppose we both earned it. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the creak of wood and the thud of shovel into soil. When they stopped to rest, she poured coffee from a thermos and handed him a cup. Jonah's coming this weekend, she said. He's been working on a video about all this. Calls it the minute that changed everything. He wants to show people the part where you didn't say a word. Eli took a slow sip, the steam fogging his breath. People don't need more noise about silence, he said, but there was no irritation in his tone, only acceptance. Mara leaned on the fence, watching Red Ember nudge at the hay. He's calmer now, still cautious, but different. It's like he's learning to belong to peace. Eli nodded. Peace isn't something you learn once. You start over every day. In the distance, the low rumble of a truck approached. Sheriff Deke's vehicle pulled up in a cloud of dust. He stepped out, his hat low against the wind. "Got a letter for you?" he said, handing over a white envelope. "Came from Vale's lawyer. Looks official." Eli opened it slowly, scanning the print. It wasn't a threat this time, just a single-page release form. All disputes settled. All rights waived. At the bottom, Conrad Vale's signature. A sharp black slash, but no anger behind it. "He's done," Deke said. "Pulled out of town last week. Guess there's no market for quiet miracles." Eli folded the paper neatly and tucked it into his pocket. Let him build somewhere else. Maybe noise is all he's got left to sell. The sheriff tipped his hat, eyes soft. "You know, people still talk about that day. Some say you changed the town." Eli chuckled. "I doubt it. Towns don't change because of one man. They change when they finally get tired of shouting." As the sheriff drove off, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of children laughing down the road. Mara smiled. "You hear that?" "Yeah," Eli said. "That's the only kind of noise worth keeping." Later that evening, as the sun folded itself behind the peaks, Jonah arrived, his camera dangling at his side. He was taller now, shoulders broader, but his eyes still held that open wonder that never quite fades from good souls. He waved shyly before setting the camera down. "I came to show you something," he said, pulling out his phone. The video played without commentary, just images, the snow, the ring, the breath of man and horse, the moment of touch, and the silence that followed. No background music, no edits, just stillness. The view count blinked on screen. 2.4 million. "They called it the minute that healed a horse," Jonah said. "But the comments, they're not really about the horse." Eli's brow furrowed. "Then what are they about?" "About people who've been angry too long. People saying they want to try standing still for once." For a moment, Eli didn't speak. He looked out over the field, where Red Ember stood with his head lowered, the last light turning his mane gold. "Maybe quiet isn't meant to stay small," he murmured. "Maybe it spreads like pollen." Mara joined them at the fence, and the three of them stood side by side, watching the stallion breathe against the horizon. The air had that late spring smell of thawed soil and new beginnings. Jonah lifted the camera, but didn't record. "It's strange," he said softly, "that something so still could travel this far." Eli smiled. "Stillness doesn't mean nothing's happening. It just means it's happening the right way." The wind blew colder as dusk settled, and a faint hum began somewhere beyond the trees, a sound low and steady, like bees awakening from a long sleep. Eli tilted his head. "Hear that?" Mara nodded. "Your hives?" "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it's just the world remembering how to work again." They stayed like that as night fell. The stars appeared one by one, bright enough to paint their reflections on the water trough. Red Ember stepped closer to the fence, stopping beside Eli. The horse's breath came out in a long, even sigh, visible in the cool air. Eli reached up, resting a hand gently on the animal's neck. "Easy now," he whispered. "You're home." Mara and Jonah turned away, giving the moment its privacy. The sky above them had deepened to velvet, wide and clean, a kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of life waiting to begin again. Eli stood there for a long time, feeling the warmth of the horse under his hand and the weight of years lifting like fog. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel like something that belonged to him alone. It felt shared, alive. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to anyone in particular. "Sometimes," he said, "the miracle isn't that they calm down, it's that we do." The wind shifted once more, carrying the scent of beeswax and grass. Red Ember flicked his tail, pressed his muzzle gently against Eli's shoulder, and exhaled one last deep breath. The world exhaled with him. And under that wide Montana sky, silent, endless, forgiving, the farmer and the wild-hearted horse stood side by side, no longer waiting for peace. They were already in it. If this story touched something quiet in your heart, tell me in the comments below. Just say, "I stayed." That's enough. Hit like, share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story about hope, healing, and the bond that never breaks.